Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. So we talked about in section one what led to the crash of the stock market, which would lead us into the beginning of the Great Depression. We're going to talk more about that, the hardships of the Great Depression, and kind of go into that. So, the thing is, things are not good. Depression is going to devastate a lot of people's lives. You're seeing that the unemployment rate can only tell some part of the story. I mean, obviously, people lose their jobs, so now people are going to be without money or certain source of income. But it was more than just people's jobs being lost. I mean, their lives were impacted by this. We're seeing not just simple hardships like, oh, we have less money this week or the next several months. Okay, it was pretty much people were not only out of a job, but they're out of a home. Homelessness was a big deal. People could not afford to put food on the table. So hunger becomes a big issue. And we're talking about millions of people. Your answer number 9 is cities, and then definition for shanty towns is here in blue. Your answer number 6 is right here in blue, and then your answer number 7 is right here in blue. So you see that what ends up happening is city life gets hit pretty hard. You see that, and it wasn't just cities. I mean, even rural areas were hit hard as well. We're going to talk about that with the Dust Bowl. But across the country, people losing their jobs, evicted from their homes, they're ended up on the streets. They're homeless. They're nowhere to go. Some people are sleeping in parks. They're sleeping in sewer pipes. They're wrapping themselves up in newspaper to fend off the cold. You're seeing, people are struggling to deal with, being able to find a place to live. That the only way that they can kind of have shelter is to find anything they can on the streets and kind of create a makeshift shelter themselves, their own little shelter out of scraps, which is called a shanty town. We see shanty towns were these little shacks that sprung up of people would find, pieces of metal, wood from the streets, and they would kind of build their own little shacks for warmth and for protection. And this was mostly in cities. It's kind of like in agriculture. What ended up happening is the mud brick homes. When pioneers would head out, they would take the earth and create their own mud brick homes, and that's kind of what ended up happening with shanty towns. And then so these things sprung up, and then you see people were struggling that they couldn't put food on the table, so they're going through garbage cans and begging for food and money. Soup kitchens would spring up, and this offered free or low cost food for people. Bread lines or other lines were put up for people to wait waiting in long lines to provide for charitable organizations or public agencies. You're seeing this happening even in today's society. We're seeing that food inefficiency occurring right now in America with the pandemic. The pandemic has hit people hard. The good news is, I guess, more. We're seeing less people, being put on the street because either they're not being evicted. They're given enough time to try and pay rent. Or you're seeing is somebody, these families are putting a lot of their money into just keeping their homes and the lights on, but not enough on food on the table. And so you're seeing constantly when they're having food pantries in different parts of the country, just, giving away food for free. You're seeing people are lining up, and it's sad is because you're seeing these really nice cars, people in really nice cars, and a lot of them are individuals who have never been in a food line in their life. And so that's kind of what we're seeing in today's society of what we dealt with the Great Depression. So, history is kind of in some ways repeated itself. It's going to always do this in many ways, but Nothing to this extreme that we had seen until the 19, from the 19 until the 19, from the 1920s. This was the last time we really saw these massive lines. But this became very problematic back then, and it still is, problematic right now with the pandemic. But African American and Latinos unemployment rates were much higher than to that of whites, and that's even the same case right now with pandemic. I mean, I think people need to understand is that when things like this happen, a recession or a depression happens in our country or even other parts of the world, the low income employment is going to get hit the hardest. One, because some of those jobs are just not needed, or two, what will happen is some of those people will stay employed, but their hours will be cut to help others stay employed, and so less money is available. So this becomes problematic, and a lot of those people working those low income wages are African Americans and Latinos. We're also seeing 24 African Americans died by lynching in 1933. That was really critical during that time as people were competing and fighting to keep their jobs. African Americans were punished for this, who were some were just killed for their ability just to fight for food on the table. Latinos, Mexicans, Mexican Americans living in the Southwest were also targeted for deportation, expelled from the country. So you're seeing that a lot of whites who were competing to keep their jobs or keep African Americans and Latinos from taking jobs really put a lot of pressure on them and tried to prevent them from getting work or food. So life in rural areas was hit hard. One advantage over city life is that farmers could actually grow their own food for their families. But with falling prices and rising debt, though, a lot of farmers were losing their land because they couldn't pay back their debt. And so between 1929 and 1932, about 400,000 farms were lost due to foreclosure. And, we see mortgage rates or mortgage holders take back the property, and this becomes problematic. And people like farmers are even scrapping for food and shelter. And so also what ends up happening is there was a big drought in the 1930s throughout the Great Plains, from Texas all the way to North Dakota. You're seeing this big, massive drought, and this really hurt the grasslands of millions of acres of farmland. And so even also too, conservation was not taken seriously. Land conservation or soil conservation. So a lot of prairie lands had been, thick prairie lands had been, not protected for so long. A lot of farmers just grew the same crop every year. They didn't, do the, what is it called? Where it's kind of like you protect the land by, what is it called? It's like a cycle. I can't remember. It's like cycling. They cycle out different crops every year. So like in the fall, they grow a certain crop, and then they grow up a different crop, in the springtime. And then, during the summer, they may make it idle, don't even do anything. So then they kind of change it up in the fall. They don't do the same crop because that way it protects the soil. And, or sometimes they have three different plots of land, and so like they use two of them for 1 year and just leave one idle for another year, and then they kind of then take the one that was idle for last year and with another one and just kind of grow something and then kind of replace the other one with make it idle. So they kind of do this was conservation, and also there's overproduction. There's too much crops being produced, and this is also hurting it. So what it does is it doesn't protect the topsoil. And then when you have a drought, the drought will then dry up that topsoil that's already loosened. And then what ends up happening in a lot of the Great Plains is this wind comes in and takes all this soil and pushes it up in the air and pushes it out. Now you're left with no nutrients, no good soil to grow any crops. And this ultimately becomes a problem. So because there was few grass and few trees to protect this soil, so that hurt the farmers. And so wind would scatter this across the throughout the United States. It even made it to the East Coast in 1934 to New York City. So the Dust Bowl, your definition for it is right here in blue, hit places like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, which is your answer number 8. But the Dust Bowl definitely hit this region of the United States, and a lot of these storms prevented farmers from able to grow things, and ultimately the dust storms and evictions led to thousands of farmers having to just leave their land behind and go somewhere else. So a lot of these families would pick up and head down Route 66, head to California. And a lot of these migrants would make their way into California looking for farm jobs. Um, and I want to say The Grapes of Wrath. I think that's the movie, the book and the movie that tells the story about farmers making their way to California, and they dealt with a lot of prejudice. A lot of these migrants, especially coming out of Oklahoma, the term was Okies. The term originally referred to Oklahomans, but came to be used as a negative for all migrants, basically saying that you were, kind of an outsider, you're a nobody, you're kind of this dirty farmer from, the Dust Bowl area. We don't want you in California. And sometimes, it's a pride or a badge of honor, I think, for a lot of Oklahomans with Okies. I think, us Oklahomans, we know what that term means, and we wear it with a badge of honor for our ancestors. But I would say that, it's one thing for an Oklahoman to say, to use the word Okie, but it's one thing for, like somebody like Herb Street, who for many years would call Oklahoma State Okie State, and it would just frustrate me because you don't use that term. If you're an outsider from, and he was from Ohio, it's like you don't get to use that term. You're not from here. You don't understand what that means. And one thing, it's not Okie State, it's Oklahoma State. And two, we Oklahomans, we understand what that means and what that comes from. And we've worked so hard to rise above that. And so I think it just frustrates me when outsiders misuse that term or even use that term. It shouldn't be used by them. Because even we don't even use it to describe, but we know what that means. We know what Okie means, and we know what the devastation of the Dust Bowl and over the years, farmers who continue to struggle. So being an Okie, it's a badge of honor, but it has become a very derogative term. Had been a very derogative term at its time. And in still ways is, especially if you're not from the state. Misusing the word Okie or using the word Okie is not okay. Us Oklahomans, it's not. We don't even want to use it, but we understand what it means and how we interpret it today. But it was a very negative. It's a very negative term, and it shouldn't be used. I'm not saying it's okay for even Oklahomans to use it. I just know that it's one thing for an Oklahoman to use it. Okay, because we understand the meaning of that term. We know what that has done to us and what it represents, and we've been able to overcome that. But for others who don't understand, don't even use it. But anyway, but by the end of the 1930s, you see hundreds of thousands of farm families migrated to California looking for jobs, and they would face discrimination like that. So a lot of people are suffering through the Great Depression. You're seeing that people, the family stood as a source of strength for most Americans. And now you're seeing that with hard times, this is really testing a lot of people's moral values. This is testing people's concerns. And this is really starting to hurt the American family. And so America, we believed in a lot of values and emphasized the importance of family unity, sticking together as a unit. But now as money's getting tighter, things are getting harder. You're seeing things are making it very difficult for families to keep that unity together by staying at home and playing board games such as Monopoly, invented in 1933, and listening to the radio. Were kind of, it was kind of hard to be able to enjoy such leisure. Nevertheless, the economic difficulties of the Great Depression put a lot of pressure on family life, making ends meet, daily struggle, figuring out what to do. That became problematic. And so a lot of men were having a hard time coping with the idea of being unemployed because they had, supported the family for so long. So every day they would set out walking the streets looking for jobs, trying to find jobs. Men had a hard time finding a job. And it got so bad for some men that they stopped finding job and they just totally left their families. During the Great Depression, you see as many as 300,000 transients or hobos, as they called themselves, wandered the country. So these are homeless men who would basically get on boxcars, sleep under bridges, who basically went into the cities and just tried to live as a hobo, try to live as a homeless person. So during the early years of the Great Depression, we see there was no federal system, no direct relief needed for people, no cash payments, nothing from the government. So we see some cities and charity services did try to offer some help, some relief, but it became problematic. It became hard over the years. We see New York City, for example, its weekly payment was just $2.39 per family, the most generous relief offered by any city, but still, even that was not enough to help support some families. You even see women are dealing with hardship in this time. Um, some women were kind of the backbone of the family. They did everything they could to help their kids survive and their families survive. And during the Great Depression, women canned food, they sewed clothes, they carefully managed household budgets. I mean, you see a lot of people save things. They would just save things as much as possible, not throw anything away. I think this is, you know, it's interesting because my grandma grew up in the Great Depression, and she didn't throw anything away. Her whole family did not throw anything away, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that them not throwing stuff away was kind of like their way of like saying like we have to do everything we can to save it just in case we need it. And unfortunately, I mean, at that time, it was a survival note. It was a survival instinct. They needed that to survive. But as she grew older, that instinct stayed with her, and it created this. It made her into a hoarder, and sadly, she just didn't throw much away. And it's sad because my grandma, I get it, like, hey, you don't waste food, you don't waste this, you may need it, but unfortunately, that unhealthiness created this bad habit, and I think that ultimately will happen to some people as they grow older is this idea that I think that's part of the reason why when your parents say, hey, there's some starving kid out there who would love to eat those green beans or love to eat that broccoli. I think it started, back in the Great Depression because there was a lot of people who felt like wasting food was the wrong thing to do. And so a lot of these women also try to work outside the home, though they would receive less money than men. As the Depression wore on, we see a lot of working women became targets for enormous resentment. Many people believe women shouldn't be working, especially married women, had no right to work and felt like the men should be out there, should not be unemployed. And this became problematic because women need to work too. But, there's a stigma out there. In the early 1930s, some cities refused to hire married women as school teachers. Many women were starving to death in the cold attics and rooming houses. And we see women were often too ashamed to reveal their hardship as well. This is interesting. There's a scene in King Kong where basically this director's trying to find this woman, a woman to be in his next movie, and he ends up finding a woman who's starving, who's struggling, and this is like during the 1930s, so obviously it's the Depression, and so she basically is stealing an apple basically he finds her, he sees her stealing an apple, and obviously the clerk is like, "Hey, you stealing that apple for me?" And then he comes swooping in and buys it for her, and he ends up using that weakness to basically lure her into his film. And so it's interesting. Great Depression shows up in there. We see poor diets, lack of money causes bad health problems in children. We see milk consumption decline during this time. We see clinics and hospitals reported dramatic rise in malnourishment, diet-related diseases such as rickets Same time, child welfare programs were slashed in cities and states cut their budgets, so kids were losing good nutrition, food. Falling tax revenues also caused school boards to shorten their school year, even close schools. By 1933, we see 2,600 schools across the nation shut down, leaving more than 300 students out of a job. Some of them had to go to work, often labored sweatshops, horrendous conditions. We see hundreds of thousands of teenage boys and girls hopped aboard America's freight trains and became kind of trains to zigzag across the country to escape poverty. We see that these wild boys came from every section of the United States, from every quarter of society, sons of poor farmers, out of work miners, and wealthy parents who had lost everything. And while exciting, the road could also be deadly. Riders were beaten or jailed by bulls, armed freight yard patrolmen. This is interesting. One of my great uncles, gosh, he was a tough guy, tough guy. But he was the oldest in his family, and this actually happened to him. He basically, I don't think he even finished high school, but he basically, he was done living in poverty or struggling. He came from an Irish family, Catholic, so they had a lot of kids. So he was, oh gosh, he was one of five children. So he was the only boy, and then I think there was no, no, take that back. He was one of six because there was five girls. So yeah, he was the only boy, and there was five girls. So yeah, five great aunts. So anyway, I have five great aunts. But anyway, no, well, my grandma. So it was seven. It was seven kids. I'm trying to. Gosh, it's been so long since I remember my great aunts. But anyway, what I was trying to say is, he had a lot of sisters. But anyway, he was the only boy, and he was the oldest, and he basically, they had a hard time struggling to keep him around the house, and he didn't want to deal with living with his family anymore and struggling, and basically said, "I'm running away," and that's what he did. He ran away and kind of lived his life on his own, and it's crazy. Just kind of packed up and said, "I'm out of here," and he actually went to the West Coast and lived in Oregon for a while. But anyway, or not, was it Oregon or California? Maybe it was Oregon. Maybe it was Oregon. I can't remember. It's been so long, and I'm tired. It's been late. I'm late here, but we're seeing that actually happen throughout that time. And the hardships of the Great Depression also were tremendous social and psychological impact. People were demoralized and hit with hard times during this time between 1928 and 1932. Suicide rates actually rose by 30%, and the economic problems would rise as well. And this become problematic. Adults stopped going to the doctor, the dentist couldn't afford it. Young people gave up their dreams of going to college, so putting off marriage, raising large families, having children at all, and just trying to survive. During the Great Depression, many people showed great kindness to strangers. Down their luck, this did help. People often gave food or clothing, but families helped other families and shared resources and strengthened the bonds within the communities. And many people developed habits of saving and thriftiness, habits they would need to see themselves through the dark days ahead. So then we'll talk in the next section about Herbert Hoover's response, which is very little, or at least not at what was needed.